Hey Joel, yes, it's Jack again. Not today, this evening, this video, we're going to be crash coursing Mark, and specifically the authorship of Mark. Now, Mark was most probably writing around the backdrop of the Jewish and Roman War, a backdrop which caused an enormous amount of bloodshed within the Hebrew community and resulted in, among other things, the destruction of the temple. So it was a time when many Jewish and Christian people's faith was being challenged by Roman authorities, and Romans were persecuting people who came from Hebrew and Christian backgrounds due to the war which is going on. Now, Mark is seen generally as an account of Peter. It is a record of Peter's discipleship and his perspective, as Mark was seen as a protege or an interpreter for Peter. As Irenaeus, an early church father, states, after their departure, there being Peter and Paul, Mark the disciple and interpreter of Peter handed on his preaching to us in a written form. So Mark is essentially recording the teachings of Peter. We can go one step further and say that according to the two Gospels theory, Mark is actually recording a speech or a number of speeches which Peter delivered to Roman authorities at the time, and that these recordings of speeches were developed into the Gospels we know today, obviously with some editing, as there are important key literary themes that we will dive into with Mark. But there are a few key themes that Mark or Peter wanted to highlight in their gospel. Two of them being answering the question about whether Jesus was the Jewish Messiah or not, and how he would become the Jewish Messiah. So this is the big question of Mark, and it's the big thing that he wants answered, because at this point in time there's a large amount of confusion about Christianity, and there's a large Jewish audience which isn't sure how Jesus overlaps or conflicts with their pre-existing beliefs. So while, unlike Matthew, he isn't trying to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, he is trying to explain to people that yes, Jesus is the Messiah, and how Jesus becomes the Messiah, and he does this in a number of ways. So we find that Mark is made up of 16 chapters, and the first 8 chapters of these 16 are concerned with the first part of the question, the who is Jesus, that being the Messiah. There's a middle section, which I'll talk about later, and there's an end section which is concerned about how Jesus is the Messiah, because as we will see, he has quite a confusing figure, given he is not the Messiah that Jewish people thought he would be. So this first section, it talks largely about Jesus' early ministry. It explains that it opens with Jesus' baptism. It says that the sky opens up and God says that Jesus is his son. It's being very clear that Jesus is the Son of God right from the get-go to the audience, explaining very clearly to the audience that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. And it continues on this road while juggling a few important key themes, as we will say, but essentially spending the first 8 chapters explaining to both the reader and the disciples that Jesus is the Son of God. This means that when we get to the middle section, we get the first real challenge to this notion, because while we see Jesus as the Messiah, we all know that Jesus is not the traditional Messiah as Hebrew people saw him, because Hebrew people saw Jesus as a Messiah that would liberate them from Roman occupation, someone that would free the people of Israel, when in many ways the Messiah brought about a more spiritual change. Jesus presents this idea to us throughout chapters 8 to 11, wherein he challenges the notions that the disciples have, and the disciples become surrogates for the reader, as they are throughout a large amount of the book. Jesus says to them, through 3 different predictions of his passion, that he is going to die, and that is how he's going to achieve glory and bring about the kingdom of God. The disciples react very poorly to this, And this again ties in with the disciples being surrogates for the reader, who will of course react poorly to this idea that the Messiah is not in fact going to be a glorious person who liberates the world, but is instead going to be someone who has to die for their sins. This can perhaps be explained by saying that while Jesus has understanding of his passion, the disciples do not, and Jesus' full plan as becoming a Messiah cannot be understood without an understanding of the passion itself. So after the 11th chapter, Jesus begins the last week of his life, and the last week of his life basically explains how Jesus becomes the Messiah and how his death is such a powerful force within his ministry. Throughout this week, the disciples continue to fail to understand Jesus' ministry, and we see a number of failings from the disciples. We see Judas's famous betrayal of Jesus. We see John, James, and Peter all abandoning Jesus when he's arrested, and we see Peter's famous 3 denials before the crows. Yes. Anyway, the first and last confirmation we finally get from someone within the gospel that Jesus is the Son of God is upon Jesus' death at the crucifixion. A Roman centurion says, "Truly, this is the Son of the Lord." This is incredibly important as it subverts expectations that a Hebrew person will be the first to understand that the Messiah is here, and it subverts the fact that the Messiah is only for the Hebrew people, as clearly the centurion is not of that group. Mark's Gospel ends on a rather dramatic note with Jesus being revealed to be alive by an angel, the Marys, finding him, and the angel saying for the first time to proclaim the word of the Lord, at which point the women flee afraid, and this is how the gospel ends. Often, obviously with a lot of confusion, and obviously with a lot of drama, because we know that is not the end of the story of Christ as we know it, but it is in fact the end of Mark's gospel, and the end of the arc, and the end of the themes for Mark as they stand. So for Mark, being written in a background where there are a large amount of turbulent things, Mark is especially concerned with just the fundamental nature of Jesus and trying to explain that to people, the fact that he is the Messiah and he is the Son of God and he is also the Son of Man at the same time. This is what Mark is truly concerned about, and this is what he tries to portray in his gospel.